This is the third video and most important video of our series about Federal Reserve policy, where finally, as promised, we're going to look at an actual sample open market operation. Let's take a look at what we intend to do here. In the last video, we described how the open market operation is going to work without really explaining it. And this is the slide that we had at the end of the video that did that. We said that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York will buy United States Treasury securities in the open market. They will pay for them with reserves, but we don't know what reserves are yet. This will allow banks on net to increase their lending, and that creates credit, also creates debt because one's a stock and the other's a flow. It also creates new checkable deposits, and new checkable deposits are by definition money, included in all definitions of money. So this, in a nutshell, is how the open market operation is supposed to work. And that's what we're going to look at right here. This is not very understandable, I'm sure. But as we go through these T accounts, as you're going to see, you will eventually understand how this works. Now, what we're looking at here is very, very simple. It's an exaggerated example of an open market operation where the account changes are clear and easy to follow. So it is simple compared to an actual open market operation, but not much is lost in the simplicity. The process or the mechanism that is being described here pretty much describes how an open market operation works. So we'll qualify it here and there as we go along. And then when this lecture is over, this lecture just covers a sample open market operation and concludes, because it'll take long enough to do that. Then we'll, in part 4, begin to make it more realistic and bring it up to standards of modern day actual open market operations. So let's start with what we have. As I say here, we have to start with the Babylonian model. And by that I mean that double entry bookkeeping, I read somewhere, was supposed to have begun with the Babylonians. It dates back a very long period of time. We have to use these T accounts, this double entry bookkeeping system, to press through this and understand the open market operation. It's actually quite easy to learn how these accounts work. A financial entity of any kind, a person, a bank, a business, can be represented with a T account where assets are always listed on the left side, and debts, called liabilities in this context, are always listed on the right side, and then equity, the net worth of the entity in question, is equal to assets minus liabilities. And so when equity is included on the liability side, then the bookkeeping entries will be in balance, which is to say the left column will always equal the values on the right column, no matter how many times you change those values in a double entry bookkeeping system. So let's take a look first at an imaginary person named Sarah to show how you or someone like you could be represented in one of these T accounts. So here's a few things that describes Sarah's net worth, her assets and her liabilities. She has $3,000 in cash, for example. She has a $37,000 401k because she works for a big technology company and they have a 401k plan, so she's saving money. Sarah has a $260,000 home, and she has a loan against that home for $180,000. So in this case, you can see the asset that she owns has its market value represented on the asset side, but the loan is represented on the liability or debt side because that's exactly what it is. So the net value of this home is the difference between $260,000 minus $180,000 on the loan, and so that's an $80,000 difference that contributes down here to the equity. To continue this example, Sarah has a $12,000 car. She still owes some money on that car, and let's say that that's a $4,000 car loan. She also has a student loan for $12,000, and let's say that she has a $1,000 credit card debt. So as you can see this, looking at it carefully, the assets owned by Sarah, including those assets against which loans exist, are listed at their market value on the left side under assets, and then all of her debts are listed on the right side at the top. You subtract the value of all of the debts from the value of all of the assets, and you're left with $117,000 in net worth for Sarah. So that is how you would use a T account to represent a person. Again, assets on one side, debts on the other, equity being the spread between the two. Now we can also represent a bank in this way, and this is where we get closer to open market operations. There is no Bank of Claremont, but let's suppose there's a bank in Claremont called the Bank of Claremont. This is kind of what their accounts would look like in a T account. For one thing, on the asset side, they have what we call vault cash. We'll come back and explain that in a minute. And reserves, we'll also explain that. Government bills and loans. On the liability side, all of their deposits that they have, like the $500 checking accounts, we'll say $500 billion or something like that, but I'll use small numbers so I won't have to keep repeating the multiplier. They have $300 in time deposits. They have $200 in certificates of deposit, $200 in a category we can't yet explain, and they have a net worth of $300. Now, to cover back against some of these loans are the source of their profit. Banks earn more interest on these loans than they pay for interest on deposits. And so this is the primary business that banks are in. They also, of course, collect fees for making loans these days. So we also had better be clear about what we mean by $350 in government bills. These are U.S. Treasury bills, notes, and bonds of various maturities that we've been talking about all semester long in this class. So I'm using an abbreviation by calling them government bills. I'm specifically talking about the full range of Treasury securities, bills, notes, and bonds of all maturities. So that is what they purchase in the open market operation, you may remember, and so it's important we understand that that's what this refers to. Finally, we have two categories that I really haven't explained at all. We have federal funds and we have reserves, and we're still not ready to explain what these categories mean yet. You have to be patient about that. They're connected to each other, but we're not ready to explain them. You wouldn't understand the explanation this early. We're going to say one more thing about this, though. As we count reserves, vault cash, which is the paper money that we all use that's in circulation, this is the amount that they actually have in their vault. It's important to make a note right here that that also counts as what we're eventually going to call reserves. So vault cash and reserves both add up to amount to, in this case, $150 worth of reserves. The key thing to take away from this is that their deposit accounts are debts for them. If you look at your checking account, to you, that checking account is an asset. That was one of Sarah's assets earlier, perhaps. But to the bank, it's an offsetting liability. So their entry is the same as your entry for the balance. You treat it as an asset. They treat it as a debt to you, which is technically what it is. Now let's aggregate this Bank of Claremont to all banks that exist in the United States in a somewhat simplified bank account. In a somewhat simplified T account, I should say. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to lump all of the deposits together and call them checkable deposits to keep this simple. Now, nothing is lost by doing this. If we go back and take a look at this long list of deposits here for the Bank of Claremont, we have time deposits, CDs, and the like, and they're not included in checkable deposits. We don't want to carry those entries all the way through these T accounts, and so by omitting them here and just sort of glossing over the fact that they exist, nothing is really lost in that simplification, because if I kept the bank's actual T account in this and went all the way through it, it wouldn't change the presentation by one bit. I would just be carrying all of these accounts slide after slide after slide for no reason. So I'm simplifying here, and we're saying right now the only deposits we're talking about in this aggregated banking system is checkable deposits. And we're going to say those equal 100. Then we've got these reserves again that we haven't explained. We've got the loans that banks are using to make their profits. And they have this enormous inventory of government securities. So this might be $20 trillion if you're talking about the entire nation's banking system. And they do have a net worth that's being represented here as $10. Now let's take a look very quickly at a very simplified version of the Federal Reserve's T account. So look at that carefully. And this isn't simplified that much. You can actually find a Federal Reserve T account at this link down there, and you'll see the bulk of what they have is a list that's disaggregated of U.S. government treasury securities. They now, as you probably know, also own mortgages, which are not represented here. But their largest category on the liability side is reserves. And of course, the Federal Reserve System technically has a net worth. So that's what the Federal Reserve's T account looks like. Now let's build this up to where we do an open market operation. So here's our starting point. We have exactly the same two T accounts represented on this slide. We have the Federal Reserve on the left. We have all private banks on the right. And nothing's been changed here. This is simply what we showed you in the two previous slides. We need to explain a few things here. When we look at these reserves right here, they're not separate entries and they don't refer to anything separate. They're actually one and the same. And now we'll take our first effort at explaining what reserves actually mean. Reserves are technically, we'll call them deposits that these banks have at a Federal Reserve District Bank. So we're saying it's going to have to be qualified a little bit. We're saying that the $10 reserves here are deposits by all private banks at the Federal Reserve Bank. This is in reference to the same category. For the private banks, these are assets. For the Federal Reserve, they're liabilities. So in the same sense that your bank has a liability entry for the balance in your checking account, and you treat that as an asset in your own books, the same thing is happening here. These banks have assets of $10 in reserves. The Federal Reserve account is treating that same category as a liability. It's important to understand that. Okay, now we have to take a diversion. And this next slide is the slide that I know from the past that Harvey Mudd students have the most difficulty with, because you say, it can't be that simple, but it is going to be this simple. This is how money is created in the United States by the banking system. Money is not created by our federal government, at least not directly. The federal government takes action that results sometimes in money being created, but money is being created in the United States mostly by private banks. In the aggregate, when they make beyond the amount of lending that exists right now in a mature system, if they make $50 in new loans and put them on their books, they will create $50 in new checkable deposits to offset that. The category there shown as checkable deposits is important. We need to understand that two things that are basically the same thing are happening when this kind of bookkeeping entry is made. Again, this represents for a mature system that is expanding in the aggregate as loans are being made by these banks. In so doing, they're creating money in the form of checkable deposits, at least initially. So this is credit. When we say that there's a delta in new loans of 50, which may be $50 million or something like that, that is by definition credit, because a loan is a debt and the delta is credit. At the same time, we can say that this is new money. And so the important point that we're making here is that when a bank does this, They're creating money and they're creating credit at the same time. The credit is on the asset side of the T account. The money, the more traditional measure, is on the liability side of the T account. Now we have to divert a little bit more. First of all, we have what is called a reserve requirement that I now have to tell you about. And it's easy to explain. As it says right here, all federally insured financial institutions are required to keep an amount equal to a specified percent of their deposit liabilities at a Federal Reserve District Bank or equivalent in the form of reserves. So there's a certain percentage of their liabilities that they have to have a matching deposit for at a Federal Reserve District Bank. Remember, we said that vault cash counts as reserves, although most of this is a bookkeeping entry. This is called the reserve requirement. So the reserve requirement again tells you that a certain percentage of your your liabilities, not your assets, has to be on deposit at a Federal Reserve District Bank with which you do business. Now, the reserve requirement for many, many years has averaged 10% for most liabilities for most banks. It's actually a matrix. The size of the bank will affect the size of the reserve requirement and the type of deposit. I'm using an example from 2015 because I can't use a current example for a reason that I'll explain here in a moment. Let's take a look, though, at this traditional explanation. If the reserve requirement is equal to 10%, then if deposit liabilities are equal to 200, then the required reserves that have to be on deposit at a Federal Reserve District Bank is equal to 20. And as we look down here at the actual reserve requirement in 2015, we see that most of those are 10%. That's for transaction accounts, meaning the accounts held by banks that have more than $103 million. And of course, all large banks have way more than that. So there was a 10% reserve requirement against deposits for the largest part, historically, for a very long period of time. And we want to remind ourselves that we have already said that these reserves are technically deposits that these banks have at the Federal Reserve District Banks. Now, I'm going to have to qualify this in a strange way right now. If you were to ask me, well, what is the reserve requirement in 2020? The answer is it is zero. It's zero because they had to lower it about 3 weeks before this video was cut to try to encourage banks to increase their lending. So they cut the reserve requirement down to zero. But that's an emergency operation that was exercised in during the period of the pandemic. And they'll reinstate the reserve requirement at some time. There's a lot of this that is not relevant right at this moment because these kinds of operations used for this purpose were suspended to use open market operations for other purposes that we'll explain in later lectures. This is more of a classical explanation of the way it almost always has worked, the way it's supposed to work, and the way we're supposed to go back and make it work at some time in the future, although alas, it is not exactly how it's working in the period of this crisis. But nonetheless, it still is instructive. And as I say, we're supposed to go back to it anyway. Okay, it's about time we finally do an open market operation. So let's do it. Here's our starting point. So I'll slow down here and make sure that you understand what it is we're doing. We have the Federal Reserve on one side, and they're going to conduct the open market operation through a market where Treasury securities are bought and sold. And we have all private banks on the other. I could do this through one bank or multiple banks, but I think it makes it easier to understand if I'm saying this happens ultimately at an aggregate level anyway, so let's explain it like this. You look at the bank and you say the private banks, and you say, yeah, assets on one side, that's reserves, those are deposits at the Fed. They're matched by the Fed's entry over there on the liability side. They have checkable deposits. We're oversimplifying here for a reason. They have loans, how they make their money, and they have government bills. Okay, now we're about ready to begin. And remember, if we're going to show that there's going to be a creation of credit or money, it's going to be done in the way that we've already explained, as is explained by that little inset right there. Now, let's ask a question here. Can this banking system presently undertake any new net lending given the reserve requirement? I'm going to let you look at this for a second and see if you can answer it before I do. We have a reserve requirement of 10%. That reserve requirement is applied against checkable liabilities. Those checkable liabilities, checkable deposits, can't grow past that amount unless there are adequate reserves to do it. Otherwise, they're violating the reserve requirement. So given that the reserve requirement is 10%, given that this group of banks has $100 billion in checkable deposits, can they make a loan without violating the law? Well, the answer is no, they can't. They have no free reserves. This is supposed to be what keeps the cap on the growth of the nation's money supply. And since at least the Great Depression, up until about 2007, this was the only way it was done. This was exactly how it worked. Now, as we'll see in later lectures, this was changed in 2008 and 2009 in response to that crisis, and it has been changed again in 2020 in response to the pandemic crisis. But this traditional system has been the way all banks work around the world as central banks. This is how the world's credit and money supply is ultimately controlled, believe it or not. This system can't make new loans on net without free reserves. It is the purpose of open market operations to provide those free reserves in an orderly, controlled way so the banking system can increase credit and money without doing so in an inflationary way. That's how this is all supposed to work. So again, what is the open market operation that you're about to see? The Federal Reserve, again, will purchase $5 in government bills from the banking system and will pay for them with reserves. This is done at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in their open market operation, and this act will give the private banking system free reserves, and that in turn will enable them to lend. That, again, is the simplicity of how this works. And this is still the way it's done, with one salient exception, that now they're also buying mortgages. They started doing that in 2008, and presently they're also apparently buying, or at least offering to buy, investment-grade corporate bonds, which is new. That wasn't done in previous recessions. But we'll worry about that in the future when we qualify this. Right now, we're just saying they buy U.S. government securities because the law restricted them to that up until 2007. Okay, here we are again, all over again. We're starting again. We've got the Federal Reserve System, and we've got all private banks sitting side by side, and we're ready to go. Let's conduct an open market operation. So the first thing that happens is the Federal Reserve System buys $5 in government bills from the banking system. Now, I'll go kind of slow here so you can look at the slide to see how that's being represented. That's being shown here as a change in the T accounts of both of these systems, because the banks sold $5 in government bills to the Federal Reserve System. Their holdings of government bills fell from 20 to 15, and of course, at the Federal Reserve, their holdings of government bills rose from 30 to 35. So the net effect of this portion of the transaction shows the transfer of inventory of bills away from the selling banks to the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System is absorbing treasury bills from the private markets. They pay for them by crediting the banks with $5 in reserves, as is shown here, and looking at the blue arrow and the associated changes to the T accounts. The Federal Reserve's liabilities went up by that amount, and the bank's assets went up by that amount, and the reserves are still in question. Now you say, well, wait a minute, where did they get the reserves from to do this? Because they changed their liability from 10 to 15 and they gave that to the banks. It's created out of thin air. That's where the magic of this comes in. The Federal Reserve System has the ability to buy things without actually initially having the means to pay for it. They can simply create reserves as a bookkeeping entry by literally erasing the old value and replacing it with the new value. And that's why, of course, for modern nations, the money supply can perpetually grow no matter what. They just create the reserves for these transactions, and that raises the level of reserves in the system. That's what you need to understand. That's what students have trouble understanding about this. They keep saying, oh, wait a minute, where did they get it from? Now, it's interesting, in the time of cryptocurrencies, it's easier sometimes for students to understand it now because you realize there's a certain sense in which the capacity to buy is created out of thin air for Bitcoin and for Ethereum and the like. Also, there was some work done, but the work had no connection whatsoever to any productive labor. It was just solving a complicated math problem, and they were rewarded with something created a value, something that was created, I should say, from nothing that instantly had value. Because even today, as we approach the Bitcoin halving, you can still mine Bitcoins if you have the means to power the electricity and you have an efficient operation. And if you solve one step in the perpetual Bitcoin problem, then you are rewarded with a coin, quote, that is worth $7,000 approximately on the day I recorded this. Now that, of course, is creating spending power because Bitcoin certainly is something you can buy things with out of absolutely nothing. So if a group of computer nerds can figure out a way to do this, which amazes me that the governments around the world are just so willing to accept it, that's good, I guess, then obviously the Federal Reserve System can do it. They use a more old-fashioned approach. They just write the number down. They erase the number of reserves that used to be the number of reserves, and they replace it with a bigger number. And that, of course, allows the credit to expand. Now, we remind ourselves that we have created excess reserves in doing this. That was the whole point of the open market operation, to create those excess reserves. And we remind ourselves that the third time we said this, reserves are technically deposits that these banks have at Federal Reserve District banks, but they really didn't make a deposit. They were created from nothing by the Federal Reserve System in the open market operation and were given to the banks as a reward for passing the ownership of the Treasury securities to the Federal Reserve System. So that's an open market operation. We're not done, though, because we still have to show how this results in money and credit creation. That's one more step we have to do. So let's go back to the bank. Now, looking at the blue entries initially, this bank now can make loans, or could have made loans, because it has $15 in reserves rather than 10. This enables them to make a single loan, or more typically multiple loans, so that they can increase their checkable deposits up to the value of 150 from 100. Now, when we show loans going up by 50 and we show deposits going up by 50, we're just once again representing this little insert where we explained earlier, this is how money is created in the United States. It's created by a double bookkeeping entry mechanism where assets and liabilities are created at the same pace. In this concrete example, loans on the asset side equal to new checkable deposits, which we define to be money on the liability side, and that has the net effect of creating credit and money as the same transaction, not a separate transaction, the same transaction. Because again, the delta in loans is by definition credit, that's what credit is, and we see that the increase in the money supply satisfies both the M1 and M2 definition of money, so money therefore went up by the same amount as loans went up. This matters later because, of course, we have to decide which of these two we want to control and monitor, and we want to choose the one that's the best target variable. We're right back to the issues discussed now in Lecture 1. So, in summary, $50 in new money and $50 in new credit has been created. Now, there is an extension to this that's worth talking about. This was in MacroSim 2. And so we're going to use MacroSim 2 a little tiny bit more. We have to kind of abbreviate it because of the nature of how strange this semester is. But remember, we've got a multiplier at work here, or we had a multiplier at work a little bit in MacroSim 2. I didn't talk about it much. You may not remember it. And I'm not talking, by the way, about the GDP multiplier. I'm talking about the money multiplier. So the delta in the money supply is equal to some multiplier times the delta in reserves. It's also the case that initially, at least, the delta in credit, or debt, excuse me, which is equal to credit by definition, the delta in debt, which is equal to credit, is also equal to the same multiplier times the change in reserves. And the multiplier is equal to the inverse of the reserve requirement, which recall was 10%. So the multiplier is 1 divided by 0.10. The multiplier is 10 when the reserve requirement is 10%. And that means that, therefore, if you increase reserves by some amount, the amount of money and credit that will result from that, if it is lent out by banks using their free reserves, will be 10 times that amount. The amount of money and credit will be 10 times the amount of reserves that was created by the multiplier. And therefore, we're done. But I want to repeat the 2 key slides so that you can think about them a little bit, because again, as I pointed out in the last lecture, students don't quite see this the first time that they go through it because you're not quite sure what's going on. You don't know the definition of reserves. So I say if you loop through it a second time, it's perfectly understandable, I think. So rather than have you watch this long video twice, I'm going to repeat the 2 key slides to make sure we understand it. The first was the open market operation itself. It's exactly as we described it in the language. The Federal Reserve buys $5 in bills and pays for that with $5 in reserves, exactly as shown here. You can see the bills being transferred by the red arrow from the banks to the Fed. Simultaneously, the transaction is being honored by an increase in reserves by the Federal Reserve System on the account as a credit for the private banks. So their reserves go from 10 to 15. Again, the key to understanding this is realizing that the Federal Reserve System has the power to create those reserves out of nothing. They can create reserves to any degree that they want. If you're asking yourself the question, how is it that the Federal Reserve are declaring they could buy as much as $1 trillion in Treasury securities, where do they get that money? They don't get it from anywhere. They can buy $1 trillion in Treasury securities simply by creating $1 trillion in reserves to do it. And that's exactly what they're going to do in 2020. That's ahead of us, though. We still need to build a little more foundation before we understand that. The second slide that's so important is this one, where they took advantage of the free reserves that were created by the open market operation, increasing their reserves from 10 to 15, and that enabled them to make a series of loans up until the point they had no more free reserves. Given that the reserve requirement is 10%, they have $15 in reserves. They can loan up to $150 worth of deposit liabilities. They hit that point, they're done. But it has the effect in the double entry bookkeeping system of having the same delta on both sides. On the asset side, on the left side, it's called credit. On the liability side, the right side, it's called money because it's in M1 and M2. And so that's the way, in a nutshell, how open market operations work. Now, you may recall we talked about a long time ago, seemingly decades ago in this class, how strange things have happened lately, about using the loanable funds model. The Federal Reserve System, we said, can increase the supply of funds to any degree they want. Remember, we said that. I said, I can't tell you how, but someday I will. I have now explained it to you. This is how they can do it. This is how they can increase the supply of funds in an economy to any degree they want. Now, it may be that it's a little complicated given how they're doing it in 2020, but their primary policy operative is still open market operations. This is pretty much how they do almost everything. So we'll have to qualify this in the next lecture and perhaps the one after that. By the way, with regard to the exam, or the quiz actually, before we go through this, I'm not going to ask you anything at all, maybe, and certainly not much about the complexities of this, given the strange circumstances under which we're taking quizzes this semester. I will definitely ask you about the simple sample open market operation. You do need to know that. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay, here are the key takeaways that you should understand. This time I remembered to include them. The key to following the logic is the T account and its arrangement. You can't understand anything until you figure out what a T account is. That's why we started with Sarah and her T account. Reserves are account deposits at a Federal Reserve District Bank. These, again, I said in the last lecture, are not referring to what are called by the regulators Tier 1 or Tier 2 reserves. They have no connection to those reserves that are required by more recent banking legislation. These reserves are specific to open market operations and nothing else. Bank loans, reserves, and securities are assets for a bank. Bank deposits, although an asset for you, is a bank liability. So remember that separation between the two on banking. You have to do that to remember how this works. When there are no free reserves, the system as a whole can't lend on net. This is not saying that an individual bank can't lend, but the system as a whole can't lend on net. All reserves are created from nothing by the Federal Reserve through open market operations. The extent to which bitcoins are created from nothing is very complex compared to the Federal Reserve System. With the Bitcoin, you have to solve this problem. You have to set up your miners. You have to do all this and all that. The Federal Reserve System can just write the entries down and they're done. They've created reserves. After the open market operation, free reserves allow banks to extend their lending on net, at least in normal times. So that's why you have the open market operation. The resulting lending activity results in a net new increase of both money and credit. Again, it's important that we understand that because of the ultimate choice of the appropriate target variable in the transmission mechanism. That's going to be credit in the modern era, not money. And then finally, I'm saying it again, I always have a fill-in question about open market operations on the exam. Now, we're getting a quiz, I think, on Thursday, so it may just be about this, and I may be able to post up one slide. It won't be only on Thursday. I'll give you 3 separate days to take it, beginning on Thursday, as I've been doing in this class. It will have a heavy weight on how this sample open market operation works, including I'll have perhaps a partially filled out T account, and then you're going to be asked on the online exam to fill in the missing blanks or something like that. You need to understand how the T account works. And so the one slide that tells you that is the 2 T account slide that shows how the Federal Reserve is buying Treasury securities and how it's paying for them. That's what you have to, well, the last 2 slides actually is something you really need to nail for that quiz. And I promise you, you need to nail it for that quiz. The quiz is going to have a major part on that. So I emphasize that. Please don't forget that I said that. I want you all to get A's if possible. If not, A's and A minuses. I don't want you to have any problems. I want you to graduate if you're a senior and go out there and work for a technology company and change this world for a better place. Meanwhile, that's it. And we will talk to you again in a couple of days whenever I get the next slide set together. Do remember we have a quiz coming up, a relatively short quiz, as they all will be for the rest of the year, on Thursday, if I'm correct in my memory.